is a syndicated feature of the American Broadcasting Company.
The Allied invasion of Africa was a most peculiar venture of armed forces into the field of international politics. We were invading a neutral country to create a friend. Our concern over these affairs illustrates forcibly the old truism that political considerations can never be wholly separated from military ones, and that war is a mere continuation of political policy in the field of force.
Once Allied troops were safely ashore in North Africa, our commanders wanted to move out to meet the Nazis with all possible speed before they could bring reinforcements across the Mediterranean. But the big problem was not a simple military one. Complicating the forward movement of our troops was the baffling French political situation.
It was useless then, and for many days thereafter, to talk to a Frenchman, civilian or soldier, unless one first recognized Marshal Pétain's overriding influence. His picture appeared prominently in every private dwelling and in public buildings. Any proposal was acceptable only if the Marshal would wish it.
The people were greatly influenced by Marshal Pétain, World War I hero of the Battle of Verdun, and aging premier of the Hitler-dominated Vichy government. But to General Henri Giraud, whom the Allied High Command counted on heavily to swing the North African French over to the Allied cause, they paid little attention.
The cold reception by the French in Africa of General Giraud was a terrific blow to our expectations. He was completely ignored.
In every case, after the successful landings had been made, Allied commanders tried to negotiate with French military leaders for a permanent peace agreement.
We had our written orders from our governments to cooperate with any French government we should find existing at the moment of our entry into Africa. Moreover, the matter at the moment was completely military. I might be fired, but only by making a quick decision could the essential unity of effort throughout both nations be preserved and the immediate military requirements met. We discussed these possibilities very soberly and earnestly, always remembering that our basic orders required us to go into Africa in the attempt to win an ally, not to kill Frenchmen. I flew to Algiers on November 13th with Admiral Cunningham and went into conference with General Clark and Mr. Robert Murphy, the American Consul General in the area.
But center of attention was Vichyite Jean Delin, the key to a possible solution to our North African problem.
I well knew that any dealing with a Vichyite would create great revulsion among those in England and America who did not know the harsh realities of war. Therefore, I determined to confine my judgment in the matter to the local military aspects. In Darlan, we had the commander-in-chief of the French fighting forces.
Meanwhile, General Eisenhower's forces had already started their drive to the east to meet the British Desert Army, 1,200 miles away at the other end of North Africa. The plan was to catch the German Afrika Korps in a giant vice and then crush it from both sides.
Between us, we would destroy all Axis forces in northern Africa. Every advance by the Allies from either flank would tend to squeeze the Axis channel of supplies, and with continuation of this process, eventual strangulation would result. All during late November and early December, the piecemeal process of reinforcing our eastern lines, principally by American troops, went on. If we should fail to take Tunis, we would suffer severely, and General Sir Kenneth Anderson was given positive orders to use everything possible to gain his objective. We had a crying need for forward airfields. The air power of the Axis in Sicily, Pantelleria, and southern Italy was still so strong as to preclude the possibility of Allied naval advance into that region. Final success in cutting the Axis communications would demand land advance with continuous buildup of forward air bases and air power. To perform this seeming miracle of construction, the engineers employed almost every type of modern earth-moving machinery to be found on any large construction job in the United States.
Hastily from across the Mediterranean, the Nazis were bringing reinforcements to Tunis to strengthen the German armies under the overall command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in preparation for the showdown battle for Tunis, which was then forming. The success of the Allied military offensive depended to a considerable extent on whether an agreement was reached with Darlan and the French political muddle resolved. If not, the Allies faced a possible open break with the North African French military forces, which consisted of some 200,000 French and colonial troops.
It was squarely up to me to decide whether or not the procurement of an armistice and the saving of time and lives were worth more to the Allied forces than the arbitrary arrest of Darlan, an action certain to be accompanied by continued fighting and cumulative bitterness.
The French Air Force in North Africa had a strength of several hundred planes, which could quickly go into action against us if no agreement were reached, and greatly retard our drive eastward toward the Nazis.
It was our intention to win North Africa only for use as a base from which to carry on the war against Hitler.
When the Allies finally settled with Darlan, correspondents in Algiers were confronted with the problem of trying to explain the puzzling situation and still obey military security.
I guess you can't blame the people back home. Ike must understand why they'd react so strongly to a guy had Vichy written all over him.
The delicate pattern of our relations with Darlan was carefully described to the American people.
The press is primarily and properly concerned with providing information to the public at home. Civilians are entitled to know everything about the war that need not remain secret. Indeed, the commander in the field must never forget that it is his duty to cooperate in the task of maintaining a civilian morale that will be equal to every purpose.
But to many Americans, the news from North Africa was confusing and irritating.
Why do we have to do business with a collaborationist like Darlan?
I don't like the looks of it. Who are we fighting in this war, anyway?
But the union with Darlan in North Africa achieved for the Allies a permanent peace with the French there.
Too bad the people back home don't realize that a lot of GIs might have been knocked off if it hadn't been for Ike's last-minute deal with Darlan.
In the Allied forward area on Christmas Day 1942, General Eisenhower had dinner on a road as he returned from Souk al-Khamis, British 5th Corps headquarters. His visit had a heartening effect.
Soldiers like to see the men who are directing operations. They invariably interpret a visit, even a brief one, as evidence of their commander's concern. Diffidence or modesty must never blind the commander to his duty of showing himself to his men. It pays big dividends in terms of morale. The soldier has a sense of gratification whenever he sees high rank in his particular vicinity, possibly on the theory that the area is a safe one, or the rank wouldn't be there.
That same day, General Eisenhower headed back to Algiers for the funeral of Admiral Darlan, who had been assassinated the evening before by a French youth.
Notice of his death reached me near Baja. I immediately started for Algiers and arrived there after 30 hours of non-stop driving. My entire acquaintanceship with Darlan covered a period of 6 weeks. His reputation was that of a notorious collaborator with Hitler. But during the time that he served as administrator of French North Africa, he never once, to our knowledge, violated any commitment or promise. On the other hand, his mannerisms and personality did not inspire confidence. And in view of his reputation, we were always uneasy in dealing with him. In any event, his death presented me with new problems. While it was known, of course, that the person in the French government I trusted most was General Giraud, my headquarters was still in no position to sponsor a puppet government. Moreover, in our inner councils, we doubted Giraud's ability to establish himself firmly in the chief position. But no one else was both acceptable and immediately available. Without delay, the French local officials named General Giraud as the temporary administrator of North Africa to succeed Darlan.
But complicated as the political situation in French North Africa remained, at least the French military forces were no longer fighting against us. French troops were now allied with British and American units. In the African theater, French soldiers saw considerable action, fighting now on our side. In a bold attempt to try to reach Tunis before the Nazis could further reinforce their position there, the British First Army continued its punishing drive without let-up.
Set 10-600! 600!
Troops and commanders were not experienced, but the boldness, courage, and stamina of General Anderson's forces could not have been exceeded by the most battle-wise veterans. The bringing up of supplies and ammunition was a Herculean task. In spite of all this, and in spite of Anderson's lack of strength, his whole force numbered only about 3 brigades of infantry, he pushed on and finally reached a point not far from the outskirts of Tunis. Very early, I had determined to take whatever additional risks might be involved in weakening our rear in order to strengthen Anderson. I was quite willing to take all later criticism if only the Allied forces could turn over Tunis to our people as a New Year's present. But in early December, the enemy was strong enough in mechanized units to begin local but sharp counterattacks, and we were forced back from our most forward positions in front of Tunis. I directed that the attack be indefinitely postponed. It is always necessary for the commander to avoid an attitude of defeatism. But on that occasion, it was exceedingly difficult to display any particular optimism. Immediately the decision was reached, we were faced with the problem of straightening out our lines, assembling units into proper formations, and protecting our flank. The rain fell constantly. Physical conditions were almost unendurable. Winter cold was already descending upon the Tunisian highlands. The Christmas season brought to me the dismaying realization that there are certain limits of physical stamina that cannot safely be exceeded. I inherited a hearty constitution from sturdy forebears, and heretofore always careful of health requisites, I had come to believe myself immune from the fatigues and exhaustions that I frequently observed in others. But as the December weeks kept me constantly on the road, I definitely felt a deterioration in vigor. But I learned a lesson I did not thereafter violate. A full measure of health is basic to successful command. I did not have another sick day during the war. Since none of the scattered airstrips that we had hoped to use boasted of a paved runway, Our small air forces were handicapped, and for days at a stretch were rendered almost completely helpless. The enemy was far better situated, since his large fields at Bizerta and Tunis were suitable for operations in all kinds of weather.
The Allied offensive was stalled until the weather broke. For the troops, already exhausted by the weeks of bitter fighting since the invasion began, the rest was welcome, but not exactly pleasant. Every day they seemed to sink still further into the mud.
Morale of the combat troops had always to be carefully watched. The capacity of soldiers for absorbing punishment and enduring privations is almost inexhaustible so long as they believe they are getting a square deal, that their commanders are looking out for them, and that their own accomplishments are understood and appreciated. Any intimation that they are the victims of unfair treatment understandably arouses their anger and resentment.
In the midst of the gloom at the front in January of 1943, came the electrifying news that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were meeting at Casablanca. Greatly elated by the occasion were the troops in the vicinity, as well as the high commanders of the Allied armies and navies. The President's concern with the serious war problems still facing the Allies was offset by the obvious thrill he experienced from the visit. Some of the units then in the area enthusiastically filed past the President's reviewing post in an atmosphere charged with excitement. A few surprised GIs who had already distinguished themselves in the battle for North Africa during the few weeks just past had the happy honor of being decorated personally by their commander-in-chief.
His optimism and buoyancy, amounting almost to lightheartedness, I attributed to the atmosphere of adventure attached to the Casablanca expedition. Successful in shaking loose for a few days many of the burdens of state, he seemed to experience a tremendous uplift from the fact that he had secretly slipped away from Washington and was engaged in a historic meeting on territory that only 2 months before had been a battleground. He speculated at length on the possibility of France's regaining her ancient position of prestige and power in Europe, and on this point was very pessimistic.
Another notable meeting brought de Gaulle and Giraud together.
The local antagonism in the French army and in the government against de Gaulle had been intense, but he enjoyed a distinct popularity with the civilians. The de Gaulle forces had attacked every French official in Africa. By imposing political censorship on all, I prevented local French officials from participating in the public quarrel. It was lifted the second I learned that Giraud and de Gaulle had agreed to meet at Casablanca. The President was hopeful of a quick settlement of the situation through a reconciliation between Giraud and de Gaulle, feeling that he could convince both that the best interests of France would be served by their joining forces.
At the conference, the meeting of the combined chiefs of staff proclaimed in ringing terms our policy for the pursuit of the war against the Axis. A number of specific military policy matters were also settled.
Of immediate importance to me was the decision that the British 8th Army and the Desert Air Force, coming up through Tripoli and lower Tunisia, would be assigned to the Allied forces under my command when once they had entered the latter province. This development was extraordinarily pleasing to me because it meant, first and foremost, complete unity of action in the central Mediterranean. It was some time after I had returned to Algiers that the unconditional surrender formula was announced at Casablanca. The remainder of the month of January and early February were employed in haste to get the battle line properly organized, to improve our airfields, and to bring up reinforcements, both in men and in supplies.
Be sure to be with us for the next thrilling episode of Crusade in Europe, showing African victory. This is a syndicated feature of the American Broadcasting Company.